have it on very good authority, which means that I ask some friends who are priests, that the scholarly folks who put together the cycle of readings that we hear each Sunday don't pay any attention to American holidays. They don't say, okay, Pentecost is done and dusted. Now let's come up with something good for Arbor Day. That's not how it happens. But every now and then, entirely by coincidence, the lectionary gives us the opportunity to say something both about the readings of the day and about the more hallmarky kind of holiday as well. Today is Father's Day, and it sure isn't hard to find a sermon about fathers, and specifically about the kind of authorities fathers are supposed to exercise in today's reading. In our first reading, Abraham, the original patriarch, brings his firstborn child and the child's mother to a wilderness and leaves them there. This was an act of such heartlessness that the authors of Genesis are at some pains to take the edge off its cruelty. They do this in two ways. One is to assure us that even though this all looks ghastly, the people involved have secret knowledge and things are not as bad as they seem. At an earlier point in the book of Genesis, we're told that God gave Hagar a secret promise that her son's future was secure and that she should therefore be willing to endure the mistreatment she sometimes suffered at Sarah's hand. In today's reading, we learn that God has given that promise to Abraham as well. There's no word on whether Ishmael is in on this. The brutality of Abraham's deed is further diluted by the suggestion that his victims brought it on themselves. Again, earlier in Genesis, we're told that Hagar became haughty when she learned that she would bear Abraham the child that Sarah could not. In the reading we heard today, we learned that Ishmael was playing with Isaac, but in older translations, he's depicted as mocking him. If you've read any news coverage on incidents of police violence, you know where this is going. These two were no angels. So off we go into the wilderness. And within a few verses, God's promises notwithstanding, Ishmael's dying under a bush. And in the fashion of cliffhanging television dramas, I'd like to fade to black there for a moment. Over the years, the story of Hagar and Ishmael has taken on particular resonance in communities of color. Biblical scholar Nisha Jr. published a book last year called Reimagining Hagar, Blackness and Bible. To oversimplify a bit, the question at the core of the book is, how did Hagar become Black? Why did Black American Christians find such resonance in her story that so many people simply assumed that she was Black? Professor Jr. explores the evolution of this understanding in detail, but the outlines are there for anyone to see. Hagar is a racial minority, enslaved, a woman forced to bear a child by her mistress's husband, and then disposed of with her child when she had served her purpose and when the boy was deemed no longer necessary. When we return to the wilderness, God saves Hagar and Ishmael, and while we're told that God provides for them, they're not party to the covenant between God and Abraham. It's interesting to note that Ishmael is considered a patriarch of Islam, but not of Christianity and not of Judaism. When we talk about the God of Abraham and the God of Isaac and the God of Jacob, his name's not in there. He and his mother are written out of our narrative. So, remembering that today's Father's Day, how do we make sense of what Abraham is doing here? I think it has to do with order. God was going to create a new order through Abraham and his descendants, but not, for some reason, this particular descendant, not through Ishmael. And so to remove any confusion about who would inherit what God had promised him, Abraham was willing to abandon Hagar and Ishmael to their fate. He was a defender of an order that did not yet exist, and he believed in it so strongly that he was willing to sacrifice lives in its service. You know people like that. You hear them on television advising us that we should risk contracting a potentially fatal illness lest the gross national product fall too far in this fiscal quarter. You've read their op-eds justifying violence against peaceful protesters and advocating more. What may seem strange at first about Abraham is that he's willing to behave this way toward his own son. But obviously there's nothing unfamiliar about domestic violence. and nothing unfamiliar about deciding who is within your circle of protection and who's without. Throughout human history, violence has been used to sustain orders that are beneficial to some people and deadly to others. You only have to turn on the television or scroll through Twitter to witness this happening on our own streets today. A willingness to kill in the service of a vision, whether it is communism or fascism or white supremacy, manifests itself down through the ages. I'd like to tell you in the wake of this bleak story that if we turn to today's gospel, we will be cheered up, that we will find a vignette of family life that's more comforting than Abraham's household. And while I'm glad to know that I am of more value than many sparrows, in case the birds and humans are ever working out a trade, these following words from Jesus are hard to hear on Father's Day. Do not think that I have come to bring peace to the earth. I have not come to bring peace, but a sword. For I have come to set a man against his father, and a daughter against her mother, and a daughter-in-law against her mother-in-law. And one's foes will be members of one's own household. Whoever loves father or mother more than me is not worthy of me. And whoever loves son or daughter more than me is not worthy of me. A great deal of scholarly effort has been expended to make those words sound less frightening. I grew up in a church that has a huge brass image of the Holy Family hanging behind one of the side altars, and where the priests and nuns reminded us with some frequency that except for that one time when he broke away from his family and sat explaining scriptures to the rabbis, even Jesus went home and was obedient to his father and mother. I remember one day in 7th grade, we were watching a news broadcast during the trial of the Chicago 7, the activists who led the protests at the 1968 Democratic Convention. They were interviewing Abby Hoffman, one of the 7, and he said the Vietnam War and the protests and the trial were turning young people against old people, children against parents. I was 11 at this time. I remember looking at my mom, who had prepared the dinner to feed me and laundered the clothes I was wearing and helped me with my homework and listened to my many sorrows, and my dad, who coached me in Little League and took me fishing and got me involved in the political campaigns he worked on in our hometown. And I thought, power to the people, Abby, but I'm keeping mom and dad. I have learned over the years that not everyone fared as well in the parental lottery as I did. Still, I think the words we heard from Jesus today are jarring. The thing is, they are also true. Families do break down, sometimes along generational lines, sometimes when faced with important decisions, when new ways of thinking challenge old ways of doing business, or when people who have historically been left out of our story, the Hagars and the Ishmaels, try to write themselves back in. If there is any piece of reassurance here, it's that Jesus says that he's all about this convulsion. He's saying it has to happen if change is to come, if our understanding is to deepen, if we are to accept what he has come to teach and live in the way he lived. So back to Father's Day. When I was a child, just about every television sitcom about family life eventually reached the point where a harried mother looked at her disputatious children. And you can unmute yourself if you want to join me in this. And she said, "Wait till your father gets home." Some actual mothers got to that point too. Fathers existed to enforce order, to lay down the law, to bring force, or at least forcefulness, to the service of the common good. This was true in those sitcoms. It was true in Westerns, in which good guys subdued bad guys, and also Native Americans. True in war movies, where the good guys killed the Nazis. True in later years in Clint Eastwood's long career as the white cop who subdued criminals of color. You may have varying degrees of comfort with the violence done on behalf of the common good in these instances, and you may have some serious questions about whether the common good is actually common, since it leaves so many people out. My point is simply that this was regarded as the true work of the guardians of society, and the guardian of the home was the father. In this context, Jesus' words are liberating. He's come not to bow to this authority, but to confront it. Jesus resisted earthly authority. While he did not have a political agenda, preaching a kingdom greater than Caesar's had profound political implications. It brought him into conflict with powerful people. That's the good news. Sometimes when you find yourself in conflict with powerful people, you are walking in holy footsteps. Here's the bad news. These powerful people had Jesus killed. He won his victory through the cross, through suffering. If you are committed to living out your faith, to working for justice, to promoting human dignity when powerful forces are working to diminish it, you should expect to suffer. That suffering may be physical, it may be financial, it may be that members of your family turn against you, or it may simply be that respectable people will no longer consider you respectable. We didn't read the letter to the Galatians today, but the 28th verse in the 3rd chapter is on my mind. There is no longer Jew or Greek. There is no longer slave or free. There is no longer male and female, for all of you are one in Christ Jesus. On Father's Day, consider that the order we are called to support, the household we are asked to guard, and the good for which we are called to campaign, not only blurs, but obliterates the kind of distinctions that set us against one another. More than that, we're asked to campaign for this good, not in league with the powerful, but in step with the outcasts. We can acknowledge Abraham's fidelity to God, but we're also called to read the Hagars and Ishmaels of our own time back into the narrative. We are challenged to understand that Jesus was the Prince of Peace, but we will not realize peace without upheaval. We are asked to pledge our faith in a crucified Messiah, a God who died. Rose, yes, but died first. This is work for fathers. This is work for mothers and children and siblings of every variety. This is work for humanity. It is a story that begins for us in the Hebrew Scriptures, and it continues everywhere you look. Amen.